Now, Ghana's debt to the IMF increased by 35.55% over the time period under consideration, per data from the IMF's quarterly finances for July ending 2023. Now, this accounts for 9.55% of the 17.68 billion special drawing rights SDR in total loans still owed by the fund to African countries. Well, simply put, Ghana has been experiencing what some would say is the worst economic crisis in a generation, and as a result, it has resulted in the default of most external debt. Today, we are analyzing the cause of this debt crisis and possible solutions. And of course, we're not doing that without my guest. Today, I have joining me to discuss this issue. First, Lord Mensah, financial economist at the University of Ghana. Thank you so much, Lord Mensah, for joining us.
Yeah, you're welcome, sir.
It's a pleasure. All right, we also have Professor John Gatsi, the Dean of the University of Cape Coast School of Business, Cape Coast, Ghana. Thank you, Professor John, for joining us.
Thank you.
All right, gentlemen, thank you for being here. Now let's go straight to the meat of the matter. The latest GDP figures released by the Ghana Statistical Service have highlighted a decline in the growth of the economy, particularly in the industrial sector. I think I'm going to ask Lord Mensah first. Could you help us understand why this decline is being recorded? Why that much reduction in the economy?
Yeah, obviously, it's something that we're expecting, and it's not a surprise, for Ghana's GDP to drop by that margin. Of course, if you anticipate economic growth, there are precursors to economic growth. The way businesses are spending, the way individuals goes about their activities and all those. In other parts of the world, they don't normally rely so much on, GDP to determine, the dynamics of the economy, because GDP is an aggregation for which, at the end of the day, it may, subsume some idiosyncratic, effect which individuals and households may be experiencing. Now, Ghana's situation, like I said, is not surprising because for some time now, the Ghanaian economy has been overly concentrated on, government activities. And I always, split, the economic agents into three. We have individuals, we have businesses, and then we have government. Now, usually, economy gets expanded and then gets to the doorstep of individuals. When businesses are, active on the ground and they are employing. But a situation where government holds up and try to, run the usual activities that is supposed to be pushed to, the private sector, then you expect that, a lot of inefficiencies and a lot of, difficulties will be faced, as far as the economic management is concerned. Now, government had, that kind of aggressive posture, over the years, with an intention of expanding the economy, at the same time creating jobs for the people. But you see, when you run an economy and it turns out that your supervision and all things tends to be politically twisted, then obviously you may end up, getting into trouble because we had government that has been running the economy, came in with aggression, established several ministries, thinking those ministries are going to be, ministries that will run government policy to the latter to make sure that they get to be effective. But then it turns out that those ministries tend to be, more or less an avenue to channel funds to, political actors. And we know, when funds get to the political actor, it may not be productive because they also invest their time, they invest their energy, invest everything they have in politics. And as a result of that, when their government is in power, it tends to be a payback time. And creating those ministries was more or less, and filling it with political actors was more or less a payback time for party actors. And a lot of government spending, went into, inefficient or unproductive sectors of the economy, getting into people's pockets, getting into areas that will not necessarily create the jobs that is, required. So clearly, government with its aggression, created that kind of huge, budget deficit, i.e., always reading budgets that, what they intend to generate as a result of revenue, will be lower than, the expenditure, way above it. Sometimes the gap is about maximum about 15% and all those. And that is not, ideal way, because you may have to finance this, deficit through borrowing and other things. So we got to a point where we were borrowing, and what broke the camel's back was when we got to a point where the international market blocked us. We've been in this situation before, but then we had access to the international market to correct the situation, because there was a point in time where in Ghana, the yield curve, if I say the yield curve, what I mean is the short-term interest rate, being higher than the long-term. And normally, when your economy has interest rate structures that is behaving that manner, it is difficult, to manage, the economy, because all funds are short-term and you cannot get money to do long-term investment. And that is the current situation Ghana is facing now. We've been in that situation before, but then the difference is that we had access to the international market at the time. And so we borrowed from the international market long-term, and then we use it to finance, the stressful short-term, financing of debt in the country. And as a result of that, we're able to turn the yield curve to long-term. So the investor appetite, started going into long-term. And that is when we had a situation of government long-term bond attracting higher rates than, the short-term, treasury bills and all those things that they do. So effectively, it has to do with economic management. And the position, like I said, was so aggressive to the extent that we're excessively overheating the system. And, if you excessively overheat every economy, your indicators, start going up, because to the point where Ghana were growing around 7%, GDP per year. And, once you start overheating it, and then interest rates were also going up at a point in time without, control. It may have to come down. And if it does not come down through the market forces, then obviously you expect that, there will be a force, through interventions. And that is what we saw with the debt restructuring that has, crippled the economy to the extent that, the finance minister keeps on announcing, debt restructuring every now and then, as if it's kind of an economic tool that you can operationalize to, make sure that you get the economy in order. But not knowing, every time, the government does that, it puts pressure in the short term, because the signals to the long term, which as a result of, the debt restructuring, is quite dangerous from the perspective of the investor. And as a result of that, every investor starts doing, short term. And so, that is the situation that Ghana finds itself in now.
Okay, Professor Mensah, thank you so much. That was actually very extensively insightful. Thanks for giving us...
Good for the correction. Good for the correction. You've added my title. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for your patience. Okay, now I'm going to come to Professor Gatsi. But before I do that, we have someone else joining us, Joe Jackson. He is the Director of Business Operations, Delex Finance in Accra, Ghana. Thank you, Joe Jackson, for joining us. Okay, now back to Professor Gatsi. Professor Mensah did mention something where he said that at a time, there came a time where it was as though the priority was not exactly in the right place. That's just me paraphrasing. So I'm going to ask you, Professor Gatsi, is Ghana still in that phase of minoring on the major and majoring on the minor. So basically talking about displaced priority, regarding the budget deficit.
Well, that is not far from the truth, but we need to appreciate what is happening in the country. Both individuals, government, and the business sector is actually not spending on business development, on production, etc. The business environment is choked with many taxation, and there's pressure on business to meet repayment obligation in terms of interest, and individuals are being saddled with high inflation and their purchasing power is truncated, etc. So it is not surprising to see the growth being announced to be very unexpected. But what happened is not a one-day affair, it's a accumulation of activities that has led us to this point. If you recall, when we were having COVID, we realized that we were overspending and then we were overborrowing. These issues were raised, but the government didn't pay heed. Then COVID came, and that we thought that COVID will actually be short-lived. So we were actually using the COVID to borrow unnecessarily. And the borrowing that we were doing was such that it became unsustainable. But we continue until we were declared unsustainable. Then we have to face the problem of credit rating agencies downgrading us, therefore locking us out of the international capital market. So the main problem has to be the fiscal situation that we have created. We have engaged in a lot of activities only for show, but we were not spending money on those activities. And that is what has caused the problem. In 2020, we have borrowed so much in the name of COVID, but we have spent it on election. So that is the cumulative effect that created the problem in which we are today.
Right. Okay. Thank you for that, Professor Gatsi. Now, very quickly, I'm just going to, Joe Jackson, can you please confirm that you can hear us?
I can hear you clearly. Can you hear me?
Yes. All right. Welcome on the show. Now, Joe Jackson, about 4 months ago, there was a strong program of reforms that was meant to revitalize the country's economy and reduce the debt burden. But seemingly that didn't work. Is there a reason?
Yes, there is a reason. The reason was that the programs were rammed through. It was not as if the programs were there was enough engagement with the stakeholders to bring this program to a good conclusion. Let's take the tax reforms. A lot of taxes were lumped up, but people are upset. Then when you take the debt exchange program, the government acted in a fairly arrogant manner, not engaging with those stakeholders, so that there is a lot of disaffection. The programs haven't had the effect they were supposed to. We were supposed to have a huge amount of emphasis placed on monetary reform in an economy where on the monetary policy, in an economy where large amounts are informal, in an economy where the government itself is the biggest culprit. Nothing much has worked. Last year, the central bank made a loss of over 60 billion cedis, $5 billion. And that loss was directly attributed to money deficit financing that he gave to the government of Ghana. So the reforms won't work because literally you are kicking in the reforms through reforms and turning around on the back door to sabotage all those reforms. It didn't work because the government itself was sabotaging its own reforms.
Okay. Thank you so much, Joe Jackson, for that. Now, very quickly, Professor Lord Mensah, say the funds come in. What would be the priority? Would it be stabilizing the country's economy or reducing the debt burden by paying off some of the debt? Maybe not all at the exact instance, but what will the priority be for Ghana?
Yeah, well, it's a mix of economic problem, and it's a matter of tackling the situation, simultaneously. Technically, every economic problem is an optimization problem. So we should, find a way to, satisfy our debt obligations, and at the same time, whilst doing that, we'll be able to build, the economy. Now, how does, government get money or government activity, get operationalized to build an economy? It's a matter of funds flow. It's a matter of fund flow. And we've been always calling the government to find a way to prioritize its activities. This is a government that, we're all anticipating that, as a country that is going through economic depression, you don't, engage in certain spending. And let me emphasize on that. Because the more you spend, the more you need money. And as we speak now, we don't know where government is getting money to do some of its projects, because we are aware that our debt is on our neck. And at the same time, when you consider the government's activities, in the budget review that government just did, we're expecting that, they will, reduce, some of the capex and some of the goods and services. And these are discretionary expenditures that government has control over. But I believe that, that is where, the flexing of the political muscle is. And as a result of that, they may not want to renege on that. And they are better off pushing, that spending rather to, the investor community. And that is why, the government keeps on, calling for debt restructuring here and there. And as a result of that, sending a bad signal to the investor community.
All right.
And by so doing, keeping the short-term interest rate on the high side.
All right, thank you so much for that, Professor Lord Mensah. Now, Professor Gatsi, are there any plans in place for this debt restructuring, saying that now we've said that the reform as of 4 months ago didn't work? Is there going to be a restructuring of the plans, or what is the government aiming to do?
Well, I think the restructuring of the debt itself is not a plan that is so built on salvaging the government out of the problem. It's only giving some space to government to reduce the debt burden, especially the interest burden. But as time goes by, as to whether government is able to raise revenue to pay the new debt coupons and the maturity is also becoming very difficult. Just a few weeks ago, about 2 billion of the interest was due. The government defaulted, and after a few days before they were able to, put themselves together to pay. So that means that we still have problem with repayment of the debt. But the debt exchange program itself was just to allow the IMF to be able to come on board. Now, the IMF had brought on board a lot of reforms in the cocoa sector, reform in the Bank of Ghana, reform regarding our fiscal structure, etc. We want to see the government confront these things upfront and begin to implement them for us to see. The one that we see the government frontal in dealing with is revenue mobilization. And even that, the approach of revenue mobilization is undermining revenue collection because businesses see this approach to be very disturbing in terms of putting pressure on them, etc.
Okay.
So that is being done, but there are many other reforms that we have not seen anything being done yet.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much, Professor Gatsi, for that. Now, very quickly and finally, Joe Jackson, what are your hopes for Ghana? How do you hope that the country comes out of the debt crisis that they're in?
To be honest with you, it's a tough time we are in. We are entering into an election year. I expect us to limp along for the rest of this year and 2025. And it is only with the change of government and only with a reset that I'm expecting things to improve. So really, I believe that the rest of this year and next year we would lurch from crisis to crisis, and that it is 2025 that we should expect some improvement.
All right. Professor Lord Mensah, Financial Economist, University of Ghana. Professor John Gatsi, the Dean of University of Cape Coast, School of Business, Cape Coast in Ghana. And of course, last but not the least, Joe Jackson, Director of Business Operations, Dalix Finance, Accra, Ghana. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for making this a very insightful and, of course, informative segment on VSA.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure. Well, that's it on Village Square Africa for today. We have extensively discussed these issues and, of course, preferred solutions to them. Now, for more of this, do want to follow us on all our social media platforms and join us again on Village Square Africa as we dissect Africa issues together. My name is Blessings Mosugu. See you again.